When I first moved into the neighborhood, I never imagined that something as simple as a garden could spark such a storm of conflict, resentment, and ultimately vindication. My home wasn't particularly extravagant, nor was it meant to stand out. It was a modest, older property on a quiet street that had seen generations of families come and go. The front yard, however, was a little different. Unlike the manicured lawns that surrounded it, trimmed to perfection and adorned with cookie-cutter flower beds, mine was a living tapestry of history, color, and a kind of wild beauty that most people either loved or hated. The garden had been there long before I ever set foot in the neighborhood. When I bought the house, I inherited not just its four walls, but also its layered history, which spilled into the soil outside. My front yard was not the standard patch of turf the HOA seemed to worship. Instead, it was a mixture of heirloom roses, creeping vines, and rare perennials that had been cultivated over the years by the previous owner, a retired botanist who had spent decades preserving species no longer found in mainstream nurseries. Some of the plants were over half a century old, their roots reaching deep into the earth, holding secrets of another era. At first, I thought my neighbors would appreciate the uniqueness. After all, not every suburban block could boast a yard filled with plants that told a story stretching back decades. But I quickly learned that appreciation was not the language of my HOA. Conformity was. The other houses on the street all looked eerily similar, as if they had been copied and pasted from a real estate brochure. Perfectly trimmed hedges, identical trees, the same bland green grass stretching across the front lawns with military precision. Anything outside this narrow definition of acceptable landscaping was considered a violation. And my yard, with its abundance of color and untamed charm, was their prime target. The first letter arrived just 2 weeks after I moved in. The HOA board, in its stiff and impersonal tone, informed me that my garden was not in compliance with community standards. They claimed it looked unkempt, disruptive to neighborhood harmony, and aesthetic nuisance. At first I laughed it off, thinking it was a misunderstanding. How could something so alive, so meticulously nurtured by the hands of a botanist, be considered ugly? I assumed a polite explanation would clear things up. But the letters didn't. Stop. Every week, a new envelope arrived, each one thicker with threats than the last. They escalated from warnings to fines. At first, the fines were small, $50 here, $100 there. But as I continued to ignore their demands to remove the garden and replace it with standard grass, the penalties grew. Before long, the HOA slapped me with a staggering $5,000 fine, claiming my refusal to comply had disrupted property values and violated the community covenant. I remember the morning I opened that envelope. My hands trembled as I read the words, each one sharper than the last. $5,000, simply because I had a garden that didn't fit into their narrow definition of beauty. It felt surreal. How could flowers, roses, and vines, living things that carried history and meaning, be reduced to a line item in a financial punishment? To them, it wasn't about beauty. It was about power, control, and ensuring that no one dared to deviate from the sterile template they enforced. The fines weighed heavily on me. I could already picture the smug faces of the board members, sitting in their air-conditioned offices, congratulating themselves on forcing another homeowner into submission. Neighbors began whispering as they walked by, some with disapproving glances, others with quiet curiosity. I could feel the pressure mounting, the invisible line being drawn between me and the rest of the community. Yet, despite the stress, I refused to yield. What the HOA didn't know, and what I hadn't even realized fully myself, was that the garden wasn't just a quirky patch of plants. It was something far greater. The retired botanist who once lived here had left behind more than a yard. He had left behind a legacy. Hidden in the overgrowth were species of plants considered rare, some even endangered. The stone pathways, though cracked with age, led to structures built in the early 1900s, remnants of an era when this land had been part of a much larger estate. Every corner of the garden told a story, not of neglect, but of preservation. I started, researching, digging into the history of the property, tracing its lineage through city records and old maps. To my astonishment, I discovered that the garden was once part of a recognized historic estate from the early 20th century, maintained by a family that had played a significant role in the development of the city. Over the decades, the estate had been broken up and sold in parcels, but my property remained one of the few pieces where the original landscaping had survived untouched. With every piece of history I uncovered, my determination grew. I wasn't just defending a garden. I was standing up for a living artifact, a fragment of the city's heritage that had somehow slipped under the radar. And as much as the HOA saw my garden as ugly, the city itself was beginning to see it differently. By sheer chance, I crossed paths with a local historian while searching through records at the city archives. When I mentioned my address, his eyes lit up. He told me he had been searching for remnants of the old estate for years, never realizing that part of its original garden still existed. Within days, he brought a team of preservationists and city officials to see the property for themselves. What followed was nothing short of astonishing. They walked through the garden slowly, examining each plant, each pathway, each weathered stone bench. Their excitement was palpable, their voices filled with awe as they realized the significance of what they were seeing. To them, this wasn't just a quirky homeowner resisting conformity. It was a piece of history, a treasure that deserved protection. That evening, as I watched the sun set over the vines and roses, I knew something had shifted. The battle with the HOA was far from over, but for the first time, I felt hope flicker within me. The garden wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the city, to history, to something larger than myself. The very next day, a letter arrived in my mailbox. But this time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was from the city council. The letter declared that my property had been officially recognized as a historic landmark, valued at $500,000, not because of the house, but because of the garden the HOA despised so much. As I held the letter in my hands, a wave of vindication washed over me. The very thing they had tried to destroy had now been elevated beyond their reach. My so-called ugly garden had become untouchable, immortalized by the city itself. But little did I know, this recognition was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't about to surrender quietly, and the war over my garden was about to escalate in ways I could never have predicted. The morning after receiving the city's letter, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. For weeks, I had lived under the constant barrage of HOA notices, fines, and veiled threats. But suddenly, the balance of power had shifted. For once, I held in my hands a document that gave me not just protection, but leverage. My so-called ugly garden, dismissed as a nuisance by the HOA, was now a designated historic landmark. To destroy it would no longer be a matter of personal preference or community standards. It would be a violation of city law. I should have expected the backlash, but part of me still hoped that the HOA would back down, accept the decision, and let the matter rest. That hope lasted less than 48 hours. On the third morning, a letter was taped to my door, bold red letters at the top declaring, "Final Notice of Non-Compliance." According to the HOA board, the city's designation was irrelevant to their authority. They insisted that as a member of the community, I was bound to follow their landscaping guidelines regardless of outside recognition. They not only refused to acknowledge the landmark status, but also doubled down, claiming the fines would continue to accrue until I rectified the so-called violations. The arrogance was staggering. In their eyes, their power superseded the city's, as though their bylaws carried more weight than official legislation. It would have been laughable if it weren't so menacing. The fines now exceeded $5,000 and were compounding daily. Every letter carried a heavier tone of intimidation, threatening liens, legal action, and even the possibility of foreclosure if I did not comply. The neighbors began to notice the escalation. Some, clearly aligned with the HOA, openly sided against me, whispering as they walked past, shaking their heads at the sight of the garden that had now made headlines in the local newspaper. Others, however, began approaching me quietly, slipping words of encouragement when no one else was watching. A few confessed that they admired my persistence, that they too felt suffocated by the HOA's iron grip, but lacked the courage to resist. My battle had become more than personal. It was symbolic, a test of whether one homeowner could stand up against an institution that thrived on fear and submission. The city's involvement, however, had stirred more than just whispers. Within a week, local journalists showed up at my doorstep, cameras in hand, eager to document the conflict between a homeowner defending history and an HOA bent on conformity. Articles painted my garden as a cultural gem, a rare remnant of the city's past, juxtaposed against the sterile sameness of the HOA-controlled lawns. Photos of the roses, the vines, and the weathered stone benches began circulating online, attracting a wave of public support. What the HOA had tried to bury under fines was now blooming across social media feeds, drawing attention far beyond the boundaries of our neighborhood. But public sympathy only seemed to fuel the board's rage. At the next HOA meeting, held in their usual cramped community hall, the atmosphere was electric with tension. I didn't even need to attend to know what was being said. The murmurs filtered back through neighbors and acquaintances. The board declared me a threat to the integrity of the community, warning others that my defiance could set a dangerous precedent. If one homeowner could refuse to comply, they argued, soon everyone would start breaking the rules. Their words dripped with fear. Fear of losing control, fear of a crack forming in the carefully constructed facade of their authority. Behind closed doors, however, their tactics grew nastier. Anonymous complaints began piling up against me, alleging all sorts of fabricated violations, noise disturbances, improper trash disposal, even accusations of harboring pests due to the overgrowth in my yard. Each claim was baseless, but the intent was clear: to bury me under so much bureaucracy and harassment that I would eventually give in. Yet every time they tried to strike, the city's designation shielded me. Inspectors confirmed again and again that the garden was protected, that their orders to alter or destroy it carried no legal weight. This only enraged the board further. They were discovering, perhaps for the first time, that their authority had limits. And the more they pushed, the more those limits became apparent not only to them but to the rest of the community. I found myself growing stronger in the face of their hostility. What once felt like a lonely struggle was now backed by history, by the city, and by a growing chorus of supporters who saw my fight as their own. Still, beneath the surface, I knew the HOA wasn't finished. They thrived on control and people, like that rarely surrendered without a final, desperate attempt to reclaim dominance. The breaking point came one Friday morning when I discovered a notice pinned directly to one of the stone benches in my garden. This was no ordinary letter. It was an official notice of lien, claiming that because I had failed to pay the accumulating fines, the HOA was initiating proceedings to place a lien against my property. According to them, my home itself could eventually be seized to satisfy the debt. The arrogance of taping such a threat directly to the very landmark they sought to erase was almost surreal. For a moment, fear threatened to consume me. The idea of losing my home, not just my garden, was terrifying. But as I held the paper, the anger burning through me quickly drowned out the fear. They had overplayed their hand. In their desperation, they had crossed into territory where the law was no longer on their side. A lien placed in contradiction to city and state protection statutes was not just baseless, it was illegal. I reached out to an attorney recommended by the city's preservation office, a woman who had built her career defending homeowners against predatory HOAs. When I laid the pile of letters, fines, and now the lien notice across her desk, she shook her head in disbelief. In her words, this was not just harassment. It was abuse of power on a scale that could bring serious consequences for the board. Together, we began preparing a case, gathering documentation of every letter, every baseless claim, every act of intimidation. My attorney explained that what the HOA had done went beyond civil enforcement of community standards. It bordered on fraud and malicious intent. And if proven in court, the consequences would not fall on me, but on them. Even as the legal wheels began turning, the garden itself seemed to stand taller, as if it too sensed the coming storm. The roses bloomed brighter, the vines climbed higher, and neighbors who had once turned away now stopped to admire its beauty openly. What the HOA had labeled as an eyesore was now being celebrated as a symbol of resilience. The next weeks would prove crucial. The HOA was doubling down, convinced they could break me with sheer force, but they had underestimated the power of history, the law, and the will of someone who refused to bow to bullying. As the sun set over the landmark garden one evening, painting the roses gold, I realized the battle had moved far beyond fines or bylaws. This was now about principle, about whether a handful of power-hungry board members could strip away individuality, heritage, and freedom with the stroke of a pen. What they didn't know was that every move they made was bringing them closer to their own downfall. And the fight that began with a $5,000 fine was about to explode into a war that would expose the very core of their corruption. The HOA's threats had reached a fever pitch. What began as letters and fines had escalated into the filing of a lien, an act so brazen that it nearly cost me a night's sleep. But fear, as sharp as it first felt, quickly hardened into something stronger. With my attorney now involved, the balance of power was shifting yet again, and this time the HOA had no idea what storm they had invited upon themselves. The first step was gathering evidence, and fortunately, I had plenty. Every threatening letter they sent, every fabricated complaint, every fine stacked upon the last, I had kept it all. At first, I had saved the paperwork out of sheer stubbornness, but now it became ammunition. My attorney organized everything into binders, complete with dates, signatures, and photographs of the garden showing its pristine condition. The image of an unkempt nuisance that the HOA was peddling fell apart when compared to the evidence. Instead, what emerged was a story of relentless harassment against a homeowner who had done nothing more than preserve history. Meanwhile, the city's designation of my garden as a historic landmark had given me more than legal standing. It had given me visibility. Local news had already picked up the story, but when word spread that the HOA was trying to foreclose on a property valued at $500,000 for an ugly garden, the story caught fire. Larger media outlets began calling, and within days, my small suburban dispute became a headline splashed across regional broadcasts and online forums. The irony was too delicious for the public to ignore. A homeowner fined into oblivion for a garden now recognized as priceless cultural heritage. The HOA board, however, did not see irony. They saw only defiance. Reports trickled back to me from neighbors who attended their meetings. The board was enraged, convinced that I was orchestrating a campaign to embarrass them. They accused me of manipulating the media, of dragging the neighborhood's reputation through the mud. In their eyes, they were the victims, besieged by a homeowner unwilling to obey. It was almost comical, watching them twist themselves into knots of self-righteousness, blind to the reality that they had dug their own grave. But their desperation had consequences. In an effort to reassert authority, they began issuing violations. To other homeowners, nitpicking over the smallest details. Lawns that were a shade too brown, flower beds that weren't symmetrical, fences painted slightly off color, all became targets. Their paranoia spilled over into the community, infecting those who had once supported them. Suddenly, it wasn't just me fighting back. Neighbors who had remained silent began to grumble, realizing that if the board could target me so ruthlessly, no one was truly safe. One evening, I stepped outside to water a cluster of heirloom lilies when I saw a neighbor approaching cautiously. He was an older man, someone who had lived in the community for decades and rarely spoke more than a polite greeting. That night, however, he leaned against my fence and whispered that he admired what I was doing. He confessed that the HOA had fined him too, unfairly for having a bird feeder deemed unsightly. He had paid to avoid trouble, but seeing me resist gave him courage. He wasn't the only one. Slowly, neighbors who had once avoided me began to nod, wave, and even stop to admire the garden. The board's heavy-handedness was unraveling the very control they clung to so desperately. But support from neighbors, though comforting, could only go so far. The legal battle was where the real war would be decided. My attorney wasted no time filing a counterclaim against the HOA, accusing them of harassment, defamation, and unlawful attempts to seize my property. The lien, she explained, would not hold up in court. In fact, its very filing could expose the board to liability for overstepping their authority. The moment the lawsuit was filed, the dynamic shifted once again. For the first time, the HOA would be forced to defend its actions not with bluster and threats, but with evidence. And they had none. As the case moved forward, discovery unearthed a treasure trove of damning material. Internal emails revealed board members mocking me, calling my garden trash, and joking about teaching me a lesson in obedience. Worse still, financial records showed inconsistencies in how fines were handled, with funds quietly redirected, in ways that raised eyebrows. What began as a battle over a garden was quickly morphing into an investigation of corruption, and the cracks in their foundation widened with every passing week. The media latched on to this development with ferocity. Stories no longer focused solely on my garden, but on the larger question: how much unchecked power should HOAs really have? Experts weighed in, calling my case a perfect example of why reform was needed. What had once been a local spat was now a lightning rod for national debate, and I found myself at the center of it all, whether I wanted to be or not. Still, the HOA did not retreat. Instead, they doubled down, hiring their own attorneys and attempting to paint me as a troublemaker undermining community harmony. They claimed that the city's designation was a mistake, that my garden posed safety hazards, that property values were plummeting because of the unwanted attention. But every claim fell flat under scrutiny, and the harder they pushed, the more foolish they appeared. The pressure weighed heavily on the board members. Whispers spread of infighting, of members resigning in frustration, of emergency meetings held late into the night. Yet despite their turmoil, they refused to admit defeat. It was almost as if their pride mattered more than the outcome, more than the community they were supposed to serve. Amid all this chaos, I found moments of peace in the garden itself. Each bloom, each vine, each weathered stone reminded me why I was fighting. This wasn't just about me or even about property values. It was about preserving something meaningful, something rooted in history, against the machinery of conformity. The garden became my sanctuary, a symbol of resilience, and I often wondered if the botanist who had nurtured it decades before ever imagined it would one day become a battlefield. As the court date drew nearer, the stakes could not have been higher. The HOA had invested heavily in trying to break me, and their reputation was now tethered to the outcome. For me, the fight had transcended fines and bylaws. It had become a matter of principle, a line in the sand. If they could strip away heritage and individuality for the sake of uniformity, then no homeowner was truly safe. On the eve of the first hearing, I stood in the garden under the glow of the porch light, looking at the roses that had once been, mocked as unkempt and ugly. They stood taller than ever, blooming defiantly against the backdrop of suburban sameness, and in that moment, I realized something profound. The HOA thought they were fighting me, but in truth, they were. Fighting history, beauty, and the simple human right to live authentically. That was a battle they could never truly win. The next morning, I would step into a courtroom armed with evidence, the law, and the weight of public opinion on my side. The HOA would step in armed with arrogance and pride. And though the outcome was far from certain, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever happened next would change the community forever. The morning of the first court hearing arrived crisp and cool, the kind of morning that seemed to carry with it the weight of significance. I woke early, unable to sleep through the churn of anticipation in my chest. For months, I had lived in the shadow of HOA threats, letters, and fines. Now, at last, the stage was set for accountability. It was no longer just me against a faceless board. Today, their actions would be laid bare before a judge. My attorney met me outside the courthouse. She was calm, collected, her confidence a steady anchor against the nerves roiling inside me. She reminded me that everything was in our favor. The documentation, the historic designation, the city's involvement, the media coverage, and even the cracks forming within the HOA's own leadership. All we had to do was present the truth, and the truth, she said, was more powerful than any bylaw. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. On one side sat the HOA board, dressed in suits that tried and failed to mask their unease. Their attorneys whispered frantically, shuffling papers, glancing at me with disdain, thinly veiled as composure. On my side sat a few neighbors who had come to support me, faces resolute, eyes silently willing me strength. A local journalist sat in the back, notebook ready, while the city's preservation officer waited patiently to testify. The case began, with my attorney laying out the facts. The garden's historic status, the baseless nature of the fines, the illegal lien filed against my property, and the pattern of harassment documented in dozens of letters. She presented photographs of the garden in full bloom, contrasting them with the HOA's language calling it unkempt and unsightly. The discrepancy was striking. To the judge, it was immediately clear that this was not about aesthetics, but control. When the HOA's attorney rose to speak, the tone shifted. They argued that regardless of city designation, I had signed a contract when I bought the home, agreeing to comply with community standards. They claimed my garden disrupted uniformity, lowered property values, and posed safety hazards. They even brought in a so-called expert to testify that my vines could attract vermin and that the stone pathways might be trip hazards. But under cross-examination, their expert faltered, admitting he had never actually inspected my garden in person. The highlight came when my attorney introduced the HOA's internal emails uncovered during discovery. Projected onto a screen for the judge to see, the words hung in the air like a confession, board members mocking my garden as trash, referring to me as the problem homeowner, and joking about teaching me a lesson in obedience. The judge's expression hardened as the emails grew worse, revealing not just disdain, but malicious intent. Then came the financial inconsistencies, laid out line by line, funds collected from fines that seemed to vanish into vague, administrative expenses with no proper accounting. The room grew still. For the first time, the HOA members squirmed visibly, their carefully curated image unraveling in real time. It was no longer a case about a single homeowner refusing to comply. It was a window into corruption, abuse of power, and personal vendettas, masquerading as community enforcement. The city's preservation officer testified next, explaining the significance of my garden in meticulous detail. He spoke of the rare plant species, the century-old landscaping, and the importance of preserving such heritage. His testimony dismantled any argument that the garden was an eyesore. Instead, he painted it as a cultural treasure, one that added value to the city itself. By the end of the day, the judge had heard enough to warrant further proceedings. No ruling was made immediately, but an injunction was issued halting all HOA fines and enforcement actions against me until the case was resolved. It was a small victory, but one that carried immense weight. For the first time in months, I could return home knowing the constant barrage of fines had been silenced, at least temporarily. The fallout was immediate. That evening, news outlets reported on the courtroom drama, splashing excerpts of the HOA's damning emails across television screens and websites. The phrase, "lesson in obedience," became a rallying cry, repeated by commentators and online forums as proof of the board's authoritarian mindset. The public, already leaning in my favor, now turned decisively against the HOA. Within the community, the ripple effects were profound. Neighbors who had previously stayed neutral began voicing their frustration. Stories surfaced of others who had been targeted unfairly, residents fined for minor infractions, threatened with liens, or harassed into compliance. The board's grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and for the first time, fear was no longer their weapon. Transparency was. But even as their reputation crumbled, the HOA refused to back down. Pride, it seemed, outweighed reason. They called emergency meetings, issued defensive statements, and tried desperately to spin the narrative. They claimed the emails were taken out of context, that the financial discrepancies were clerical errors, and that my case was a distraction from the real work of maintaining community standards. But no one was buying it. The cracks had become chasms, and their authority was bleeding away. Behind the scenes, my attorney warned me to brace for escalation. Boards backed into corners rarely surrendered gracefully. She suspected they might try new tactics, stalling in court, intimidating witnesses, or even attempting to smear me further. But she also reminded me that every desperate move they made would only strengthen our case. In the weeks that followed, the garden itself became a symbol. Families brought children to see it, taking photographs and marveling at its beauty. Local schools arranged field trips, teaching students about historic preservation. The very yard, once derided as ugly, was now celebrated publicly, embraced, as a point of pride for the city. It was almost poetic. The thing they had despised most had become untouchable, enshrined in the community's consciousness as a living monument. For me, however, the fight was far from over. The case was still active. The judge had yet to issue a final ruling, and the HOA showed no signs of surrender. If anything, their desperation only seemed to harden, fueled by resentment and the fear of losing their grip on power. One evening, as I walked through the garden, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. A simple fine had grown into a battle for heritage, freedom, and integrity. What began as a personal struggle had become something much larger, a test of whether truth could stand against arrogance, whether history could withstand the machinery of conformity. The garden had stood through decades of change, through seasons of growth and decay. It had endured long before the HOA existed, and it would endure long after. In its resilience, I found my own. The war with the HOA was far from over, but the tide had turned. They were on defense now, their corruption exposed, their authority questioned. And though they would fight to the bitter end, I knew that every step forward was bringing me closer to not just victory, but vindication. The next chapter of this battle would not be fought in private letters or whispered threats. It would unfold under the scrutiny of the law, the eyes of the community, and the judgment of history itself. And as I looked out at the roses glowing in the twilight, I realized one undeniable truth. They had tried to bury me under fines, but all they had done was water the roots of something far stronger. The weeks following the first hearing felt like living in the eye of a storm. Outwardly, the neighborhood was calm. Lawns were mowed, sprinklers ticked in their rhythm, Children rode bikes down the quiet streets. But beneath that suburban veneer, the tension was impossible to ignore. The HOA board was unraveling, their authority questioned, their arrogance punctured by the courtroom spotlight. And though they continued to bluster, their foundation was crumbling faster than they could repair it. Word spread quickly about the financial irregularities uncovered during discovery. Neighbors who had long suspected foul play now had confirmation. The board wasn't just heavy-handed, they were mismanaging funds. For years, residents had paid dues without question, assuming the money went toward maintenance, community improvements, and reserve funds. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Some payments had been siphoned into administrative costs that seemed to benefit the board directly: lavish dinners, questionable reimbursements, even travel expenses labeled as research. The more that came to light, the angrier the community became. At the next HOA meeting, held in the cramped hall that had always served as their stage of control, the mood shifted dramatically. Gone were the compliant nods and hushed silences of past gatherings. This time, residents demanded answers. Voices were raised, fingers pointed, questions hurled like stones. "Where is our money?" one shouted. "Why are we being fined while you waste our dues?" another demanded. The board, visibly shaken, tried to maintain order, but the crowd was no longer willing to be subdued. The meeting ended in chaos, with residents storming out, vowing to demand resignations. Behind the scenes, the fractures widened. Whispers of infighting spread, board members blaming one another, alliances splintering, some considering resignations to avoid being dragged down with the others. A few even reached out to my attorney quietly, hoping to negotiate their way out of liability. The once united front of authority had become a circle of suspicion, each member scrambling for self-preservation. Meanwhile, the court proceedings pressed forward. My attorney filed motions to compel further financial disclosures, and each new document revealed deeper inconsistencies. The judge, already skeptical of the board's integrity, began scrutinizing them more closely. What started as a simple dispute over a garden had grown into a full-scale investigation of misconduct. The board's arrogance, that belief they could fine, threaten, and intimidate without consequence, was now their undoing. The media coverage intensified. Journalists dug into the broader issue of HOA abuses across the country, using my case as a springboard. Experts were interviewed. Horror stories from other communities surfaced, and the debate over HOA power grew louder. My story had gone national. It was surreal to see commentators on television discussing my garden, my home, my battle as though it were emblematic of a larger war between individuality and conformity, and in many ways, it was. But while the world outside seemed to champion my cause, life inside the neighborhood remained uneasy. The board still controlled day-to-day operations, and though weakened, they weren't finished lashing out. They attempted to enforce new rules hastily drafted to tighten their grip: restrictions on gatherings, new parking limitations, arbitrary bans on certain decorations. It was a transparent attempt to reassert dominance, but instead it only fueled the rebellion. Homeowners who had never once questioned the board now found themselves standing up, refusing to comply. A quiet revolution had begun, sparked by their overreach. The garden itself became a gathering point. Neighbors who once ignored it now visited openly, walking the stone paths, admiring the blooms, and marveling at its designation as a landmark. Parents brought their children, explaining that this wasn't just a yard, it was history. The HOA had tried to brand it an eyesore, but in their attempt to erase it, they had elevated it into something untouchable, even revered. One evening, as I sat on the old stone bench with a cup of tea, a neighbor approached me hesitantly. She had lived 2 houses down for years, rarely speaking beyond polite greetings. That night, she confessed that she had been afraid of the board for a long time. They had fined her once for leaving her trash cans out too long and threatened to take her to arbitration over a minor landscaping issue. She had paid, fearing escalation, but watching me stand firm had given her courage. She wasn't alone. Dozens of neighbors, emboldened by the unfolding scandal, began to organize, discussing petitions to remove the board entirely. The board sensed the mutiny. Their communications became frantic, emails filled with urgency, letters dripping with desperation. They claimed the community was under attack, that outsiders were meddling in neighborhood affairs, that I was stirring division. But no amount of rhetoric could erase the facts. The lies were exposed, the money was missing, and their power was slipping away like sand through clenched fists. The second court hearing proved even more damning than the first. My attorney unveiled new evidence of financial mismanagement, pointing directly to board members who had approved questionable expenditures. One receipt, submitted under community improvement, was revealed to be a dinner at an upscale restaurant miles away. Another, filed as landscaping research, turned out to be a weekend retreat at a luxury hotel. The judge's patience wore thin as each item was dissected, the facade of professionalism crumbling under the weight of greed. When the HOA's attorney tried to pivot back to my garden, arguing that it remained a violation of community standards, the judge cut him off sharply. The city's preservation officer reaffirmed that the garden was not only compliant with municipal codes, but legally protected. The attempt to drag the focus back to aesthetics only underscored the pettiness of their original crusade. By the end of the session, the judge issued a stern warning to the board. Further evidence of misconduct could result in personal liability for its members. The color drained from their faces. For years they had wielded power without accountability, but now the tables had turned. They weren't enforcers anymore. They were defendants, standing on trial not just for their decisions, but for their character. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The battle was far from won, but momentum was on my side. The community was awakening, the board was cracking, and the truth was no longer hidden in shadows. Yet even in victory's glow, I remained cautious. Pride makes desperate people reckless, and the board still had enough control to cause chaos before the end. My attorney warned me that we should expect retaliation in some form, stall tactics, smear campaigns, perhaps even frivolous lawsuits filed against me personally. But she assured me that the law, the city, and the growing tide of public opinion were stronger than their flailing attempts to hold on to power. That night, as the garden basked in the glow of lanterns I had hung along the pathways, I thought about how far this journey had come. From the first fine tape to my door to the courtroom revelations of corruption, what had started as a personal burden had become a movement. My garden was no longer just mine. It was a beacon, a rallying point, a reminder that even in the face of intimidation, resilience could bloom. The war wasn't over, but the end was drawing near. The board was fractured, the community was restless, and the truth was undeniable. The question wasn't whether they would fall, it was how dramatic their collapse would be, and deep down I suspected the most shocking revelations were yet to come. The final act of the saga began quietly, almost deceptively so. There was no sudden confrontation at my doorstep, no angry knock in the night, no surprise letter demanding new fines. Instead, it started with whispers, subtle changes in the air, and a slow realization that the once feared HOA board was disintegrating piece by piece. The first resignation came in the form of a terse email circulated to the community late one evening. A board member cited personal reasons for stepping down, but everyone knew better. The mounting evidence, the growing public scrutiny, and the looming threat of personal liability had made continued service untenable. That email cracked the dam, and within days, 2 more members followed suit. The facade of unity that had sustained them was gone, leaving behind only desperation. Neighbors who once cowered at their authority now spoke openly of their disdain. In driveways and over backyard fences, conversations shifted from whispered frustrations to bold declarations. "They're finished," one resident said. "It's only a matter of time before they're gone for good." The board's letters, once feared, were now laughed at or ignored entirely. Their power had evaporated, replaced by the community's collective determination to reclaim control. But the true turning point came with the third court hearing. By then, the case had grown into something larger than a dispute over a garden, or even a matter of HOA overreach. It had become a test of accountability, a question of whether those who abused power could hide behind titles and bylaws, or whether they too would be held to the same standards as everyone else. My attorney, relentless and precise, presented the culmination of months of investigation. Bank statements, receipts, and sworn testimony painted a damning picture of mismanagement. Funds had not only been misspent but outright diverted for personal use. Vacations disguised as research trips, technology purchases that mysteriously never appeared in community inventories, and even checks written directly to board members, all laid bare under the courtroom lights. The board's attorney, once confident, now seemed exhausted, fumbling for defenses that crumbled as quickly as they were offered. When the judge questioned him about specific transactions, his answers faltered, each pause deepening the humiliation. The courtroom, packed with residents who had come to witness the proceedings, sat in tense silence. And when the city's preservation officer once again affirmed the garden's historic designation, any remaining argument about its ugliness evaporated. The HOA's original complaint was not only irrelevant but absurd, an embarrassment that only highlighted their misplaced priorities. Then came the ruling. The judge declared that the HOA had not only acted in bad faith regarding the fines, but had engaged in behavior that bordered on fraudulent. The $5,000 fine was voided entirely, and the board was ordered to reimburse me for legal costs. But the decision didn't stop there. The judge also mandated a forensic audit of the HOA's finances and issued a warning that board members could be held personally liable for any misappropriations discovered. The gavel struck with finality, sealing the board's fate. The courtroom erupted, not in cheers, but in the kind of cathartic murmurs that ripple through a crowd when justice has finally been served. Neighbors clapped me on the back, shook my hand, whispered congratulations. Some were in tears, overwhelmed by relief that years of quiet suffering under the board's thumb were finally ending. The fallout was swift. Within weeks, the forensic audit revealed exactly what everyone had suspected. Tens of thousands of dollars unaccounted for, diverted into personal accounts, disguised as false reimbursements. The findings were turned over to local authorities, and soon after, rumors of criminal investigations began to swirl. The remaining board members, cornered and disgraced, resigned en masse. The HOA that had once ruled with an iron fist no longer existed in any meaningful form. But the story didn't end with their collapse. It continued with the rebirth of the community. A special meeting was called, not by the board, but by the residents themselves. For the first time in years, the room buzzed with genuine optimism. New leadership was nominated, people with no hidden agendas, no hunger for control, just neighbors who wanted to see the community thrive. They pledged transparency, fairness, and a return to the original purpose of an HOA, maintenance and cooperation, not domination. And as for me, my role shifted from embattled homeowner to reluctant symbol. My garden, once branded an eyesore, became the community's pride. The city installed a small plaque at its entrance, detailing its historic significance and noting its preservation status. Tourists began visiting, photographers captured its beauty, and local schools arranged field trips to teach children about the importance of heritage. What had once been targeted for destruction was now celebrated, a living monument to resilience. The property value soared, not just mine, but across the neighborhood. What the HOA had once claimed was a detriment to the community became the very feature that elevated it. Real estate agents even highlighted proximity to the landmark garden in their listings, turning the narrative on its head entirely. Yet, the HOA's greatest victory wasn't measured in dollars or legal rulings. It was measured in freedom. No longer did residents fear arbitrary fines or constant surveillance. They decorated their homes with individuality, planted flowers of their choosing, and gathered in their yards without fear of reprisal. The suffocating weight of control was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of trust and cooperation. In quiet moments, I reflected on how bizarre the journey had been. A simple garden, inherited from generations past, had become the catalyst for exposing corruption, toppling authority, and reshaping an entire community. I never set out to be a crusader or a hero. I only wanted to preserve what mattered to me. But perhaps that was the lesson. When you stand firm against injustice, even in the smallest of battles, the ripple effects can be profound. The former, board members disappeared from view, their reputations in tatters. Some sold their homes and moved away, unable to face the community they had once controlled. Others lingered, quiet and isolated, their influence gone, their arrogance reduced to bitter silence. They had tried to break me with fines, threats, and intimidation, but in the end it was they who were broken, undone by their greed, their hubris, and their underestimation of the very people they sought to dominate. As the seasons changed and the garden bloomed anew, I often walked its paths at dusk when the world was quiet and the lanterns cast a gentle glow. The stonework, weathered but strong, seemed to whisper of endurance. The flowers, vibrant and defiant, swayed in the evening breeze as if celebrating their own survival. It was more than a garden now. It was a testament. The HOA had fined me $5,000, hoping to erase it. But the city had named it a historic landmark worth $500,000, ensuring its protection for generations to come. That irony was almost poetic. They had sought to destroy what they didn't understand, only to elevate it to heights they could never reach. In the end, the battle was not just about a garden, a home, or even an HOA. It was about the enduring truth that beauty cannot be dictated, heritage cannot be erased, and resilience cannot be crushed. And so, as I stood in the heart of that garden one last time, I smiled, knowing that victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever dared to stand their ground against unjust power. The HOA was gone. The garden remained, and justice, at long last, had bloomed.